Hello everyone, it's Tom here. We'll get into this great episode of Last Orders in just one moment. But before we do that, I just want to let you all know about a brilliant way that you can help this show reach more people. And that is by giving us a glowing 5-star rating and review on your favourite podcast app. It takes just 30 seconds and it's a great way to help the show. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who's been sending in your postbag questions. We've really enjoyed answering them. So to send yours in and to be in with a chance to having them answered on the next episode, email them to lastorders@spiked-online.com, and that's lastorders@spiked-online.com, or you can message us on Facebook and on Twitter. Thanks so much, and now on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast all about freedom and the nanny state. In this episode, we discuss the laughing gas ban, the coming crackdown on vaping, and the madness of the ULEZ. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Chris.
Hello, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. We're also delighted to be joined back on the show for the fourth time, I believe, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Mark, how are you doing?
Hey, Tom, good to be with you. I'm well, thank you.
So we're going to kick off today. We're going to talk about a lot of irritating nanny state measures that the government is either imposing or mulling over. Let's start off with the laughing gas ban, which has been announced by the government in recent weeks as part of its kind of broader clampdown on antisocial behaviour. It seems it wants to make laughing gas a Class C drug. This is apparently against the advice of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, which many people have been highlighting in recent days. This is a curious one, Chris, to start off with, because of the fact that nitrous oxide, laughing gas, I think I'm right in saying it kills fewer people than lightning each year. It's so dangerous that they give it to pregnant women whilst they're giving birth, and yet the government have decided this is something that must be clamped down on. What's this all about, do you think?
Well, it's the previous bans have failed, haven't they? So they banned the sale of it, and they've kind of run out of drugs to ban. I think people are only taking this because they banned all the legal highs. And, people like me tend to say in these situations that banning it won't make any difference because the law doesn't really deter people. But actually, I think it has done with some of these legal highs. Mephedrone. Who takes mephedrone now? I don't know. Maybe write in if you still take mephedrone. But it seemed to me like there's a whole load of these legal highs, which people were only taking because they were legal. Perhaps younger people are a bit more scared of the law than they used to be. I don't know. But there was no huge latent demand for them. They were just legal. And then laughing gas became pretty much the last thing that was legal. And people are doing this incredibly mild drug. Let's face it, it's a very mild. I know, it's not 100% safe or anything, but it's not, crack again, is it? And the main objection to it seems to be that people leave these little capsules lying around, which seems a pretty weak reason to ban anything, really. It's a littering issue. So, this is the government being tough on drugs, I guess they think they're being. It'd be interesting to see what happens once the ban comes in, whether people still continue to take it, because it will be easy enough to get hold of. I'm sure they can get hold of it at the moment, or whether they move on to something else. It's quite likely, I think, they will move on to something more dangerous. I mean, including alcohol, right? I mean, they're talking about this is about kids loitering in parks. Well, people are allowed to loiter in parks. That's kind of what they're for. They had, 2 years of them being kind of locked down on and off for a while. Doesn't seem unreasonable that they should want to hang around with their friends in parks. Kids have always done this. Teenagers have always done this. And to be honest, it's probably better they take a mild anesthetic than, drink strong cider.
Mark, what do you make of all of this?
Well, Tom, I've become, just a few weeks ago, an extremely staunch advocate for nitrous oxide, having become a user of it. So what happened, I hasten to underline it's for medical purposes. I put my back out badly and was in screaming agony, never been in such pain in my life. Eventually managed to procure an NHS ambulance. And the first thing they did was to whack me on nitrous oxide at 7 o'clock in the morning. By about 7:05 in the morning, I felt completely drunk, but I had gone through practically a whole canister of the stuff. But as medical pain relief, it was brilliant. I've also been the victim of quite tight regulation around that nitrous oxide, because I was then put in an ambulance. I was talking nonsense, even more so than normal, after a canister of nitrous oxide, taken into A&E at St George's Hospital. And but once you arrive at A&E, you can't keep the nitrous oxide with you because of regulations. So I was breathing as much of it in as I could, and then was warned that the excruciating pain would slowly but surely return, and I better cross my fingers that some nurse or doctor gave me codeine or some such like to ease the pain. So as the first and only time in my life I'd taken nitrous oxide, it was a little bit like being drunk. I can't speak to its medical effects, but it struck me that already it was rather too highly regulated, because I would have liked to have been puffing on it for the 2 hours I was waiting in accident and emergency rather than the pain returning. As Chris says, it's another example, isn't it, really, of a solution looking for a problem. How big a problem is this? Doesn't seem to me particularly big at all. Is the problem littering? Well, punish people for littering, whether it's nitrous oxide canisters or anything else they're throwing down as they loiter in the park. Loitering in the park, as Chris says, not of itself a crime. So yet another overreaction, but colour me completely unsurprised.
Completely. It was interesting that the lengths that the media had to go to do the usual kind of drug scare story. I mean, they found a 25-year-old woman who I think was on 10 boxes of the stuff a week and had therefore kind of quite severely damaged herself. I think I worked it out. That was something like 34 balloons a day or something. You know, you have that much of anything a day, you can end up in hospital. I mean, you know, water, apples, you know. So that was one. There was another one on the BBC, which was a mother of a son who tragically died whilst inhaling kind of aerosols like butane. And she said that she'd taken to showing his ashes to people who use NOS balloons, even though it's a completely different substance. And the article itself has to accept that they're completely different substances, one far less harmful than the other.
See, that's a good example of a drug that's, I think, has kind of gone out of fashion. You know, solvent abuse was a huge thing in the 80s, judging by the amount of government information campaigns about it, and sniffing glue and all sorts of stuff. I don't think, again, write in if I'm wrong, young people, but I don't think this is as big an issue as it used to be. And that's for the best. It's an element of harm reduction here if people are moving on from sniffing aerosols and solvents and glue to inhaling laughing gas. But 37 balloons a day is probably overdoing it. Maybe some sort of sensible health advice on this would be more effective and appropriate than prohibition.
Isn't there a worrying thing here? Have I got this right there? That usually in these sort of bans and prohibitions, what you get is a kind of hysterical overreach and demand for bans from some medical council or medical expert or the BMA. And the government sort of says, oh, well, we'd better do something, and goes about halfway. Takes some action, but maybe not as grand an action as the public health lobby wants. But in this instance, I thought the council that had advised on it said no need to ban it, won't do any good. And it's the government itself that has said, well, we're going to take several steps beyond what the medical community are asking. That's a bit puzzling. And Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, but not a typical way that public health bans come in. It's usually public health lobby pushing for something and getting, I don't know, a third or a half or 2/3 of it. Here they seem to have not pushed for something. We're going to get it anyway. Yeah,
the advisory group on drugs, I think is what it's called. They tend to be more lenient than the government on these issues. I mean, this is the organisation that David Nutt resigned from all those years ago when he said that ecstasy was safer than horse riding. I think it has a few people a bit like David Nutt who really do look at the sort of continuum of risk and take more of a realistic view of the substitution effects here. And so they do tend to be a little bit less liberal than other people in public health on other issues, and also less so than the government.
Mark, on that point, where do you think the kind of supporters of more liberal reform on drugs, where do you think they're going wrong? Because it does feel like the politics is very much going in the opposite direction on this issue as well as many others.
Well, it's odd, isn't it? I've never quite been able to get my head around this. I haven't checked the sort of recent opinion polls, but I think I saw one just the other week on cannabis liberalisation, which is a more fashionable liberal metropolitan elite cause, I guess. But if I'm right, if I remember, there was a majority for the legalisation of cannabis. So it's an incredibly mixed picture. I mean, if 20 or 30 years ago, you'd argue, or 40 years ago, for an end to the war on drugs, you would have been considered way out of the public Overton window, right? I mean, some people were putting that case forward, but a very, very fringe case. I wouldn't say that the argument to end the war on drugs is about to win, but it's now a fairly mainstream case. So I think in terms of the overarching public debate, you've probably seen a shift in the Overton window in favour of liberalisation. But on a tactical, day-to-day, hand-to-hand combat basis, you still have a government that's geared to bans. And I wonder whether the giant leap forward we've got to make is some package of liberalisation measures of, let's say, cannabis and possibly others. But were you to do that, it would then seem utterly preposterous that nitrous oxide was prohibited if you were liberalising things that all medical experts agreed were more dangerous for you.
And Chris, unless you've got anything more to add, we should probably talk about another mooted prohibition. I mean, it's early days, but nevertheless, there have been noises from the government about vaping, about kind of single-use vape products. Essentially, this is just the Public Health Minister, Neil O'Brien, announcing that he'll be launching a call for evidence. But there is this growing concern, we talked about it on the show in the last episode, in fact, about the under 18s getting their hands on e-cigarette products, about this becoming a big problem, and the beginnings of a rumbling about maybe this needs to be clamped down on, particularly to stop young people from using it. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this, and is this just sheer speculation at this point, or do you think something could happen in this direction?
I think it seems pretty certain that the government's going to hold a consultation. The media coverage saying that elf bars and disposables are going to be banned is pure speculation, as far as I can tell. But clearly there is an appetite in government, and to be fair, probably amongst a lot of parents, for the government to clamp down on underage vaping. And as I probably said in the last episode, the obvious thing to do would be to enforce the law, because rather like the littering issue with the laughing gas thing. It is way too easy, I think, for people underage to get hold of e-cigarettes, mainly from corner shops, small convenience stores. And I think if you started dishing out a few £10,000 fines, and the current fine is only £2,500 maximum, then you would soon not put an end to it, but make it as difficult to get hold of as, vodka and cigarettes, which these days means really quite difficult. Instead, I fear they're going to either ban disposables per se, or they're going to ban flavours. And banning disposables wouldn't be great, because a lot of smokers do like disposables, and there's no reason why adults should not have access to them. Banning flavours would be absolutely disastrous, and a lot of people don't seem to realise that they have to taste of something, e-cigarettes, and not many people want them to taste of tobacco, which is the so-called flavour, which tends to be exempt from these bans. And so you immediately make e-cigarettes hugely less appealing, and by association, you make smoking more appealing, which is obviously not in line with what the government's trying to do with its policy. So there's definitely a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Possibly there are one or two policies the government could bring in to make disposables less appealing to teenagers without making them noticeably less appealing to adults. I'm not sure. But yeah, there's a worldwide campaign at the moment, largely funded by Mike Bloomberg. I mean, I'm talking, hundreds of millions of dollars being pumped into campaigns against flavours in particular with e-cigarettes.
And Chris, just sticking with you for a second, I know we spoke a bit about this last time, but you've since written a piece for Spiked about this with some of the numbers. Isn't this another kind of solution in search of a problem, really, insofar as, yes, young people are vaping, the numbers are not that much up over the course of recent years, and also the number of young people who are smoking has fallen off a cliff, it looks like. So is it really that bad that young people are having an elf bar or of a lunch break or whatever?
Well, it's that thing of making the enemy the perfect of the good, isn't it? And so, yeah, smoking rates are just down to 1% now amongst secondary school kids. I can't remember all the other figures. You can have a look, the listeners, at my Spike piece. But yeah, on the face of it, there isn't actually all that much youth vaping. The figures from 2021, the most recent figures, and it is quite possible that they've rocketed up in 2022. But in terms of smoking, you'll hear sometimes these anti-vaping campaigners saying, kids are hardly ever smoking these days, but instead they're using e-cigarettes, and that's the big problem, as if these two things weren't directly linked to each other. Smoking rate amongst, I think I'm talking daily smoking rate here, amongst secondary school kids a few years ago was 4%, which isn't that high, I guess. It's now 1%. That's a 75% fall over a period of time when, admittedly, vaping has been going up. These are, to state the obvious, substitute products. They're substitutes for adults, but they're also substitutes for teenagers, and substitutes for teenagers who otherwise would have smoked. And it's naive to think that smoking has just suddenly become really uncool amongst teenagers for the first time in history. And that's got nothing to do with vaping.
And Mark, what do you make of all this? I mean, it was a public health success story, surely. It was one of the few kind of sensible things that Public Health England or the NHS would say, was that to basically promote vaping as an alternative to smoking. And yet there is still this, as Chris said, global campaign against it. What's that all about?
Yeah, we've lucked out a bit in the United Kingdom on this one, I think. We don't generally have particularly liberal approaches to these sorts of issues, but in this one we have, probably more by accident than design, I think. I think a lot of it goes back to David Cameron being persuaded 10 or 12 years ago not to regulate e-cigarettes out of existence at birth. But rather to your point, Tom, I wonder whether the purists amongst us need to fight back on, what exactly is the problem here. We've got this weird public debate in which there's huge pressure from people to lower the voting age to 16, but we are absolutely adamant that a 16-year-old must not be trusted with an elf bar or half a pint of shandy until 2 years into being enrolled on the electoral register. Pretty surprising. And I mean, clearly you want to set some sort of age limit. I don't think 5 or 6-year-olds should be playing around with elf bars, but it's always going to be a bit fungible. I guess can say, well, let's enforce the law better. But I don't really mind if it's a bit flaky around the edges. I think I started smoking cigarettes when I was 16. It was legal to smoke at 16 at that time. I didn't need to, have some fake ID or anything. But I started drinking in pubs when I was about 16. Wasn't a particular problem. Some pubs had age checks. We seem to have got an awful lot stricter here on these sort of things. And you guys would probably know the literature about the health impacts of these things, but it is minuscule compared to smoking cigarettes, right? So is it really a problem if quite a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds are using elf bars rather than smoking combustible cigarettes? As Chris says, it's a substitution effect. You should celebrate that as a success. And I couldn't quite get my head around whether, is this a public health intervention or an environmental health thing? Are we supposed to be worried here about disposable plastic? Or are we worried about elf bars causing you some health mischief? I thought it was a bit more slightly like the nitrous oxide thing. The former, that we are now launching attacks on people's freedoms potentially on the grounds of we want to stop littering rather than really any health or medical basis of it. So I would take quite a relaxed view. I think if you, as a small newsagent, accidentally sell an elf bar to a 17-year-old, I'm not totally persuaded a £10,000 fine is proportionate.
Chris, anything you want to come back on there?
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with that around the edges, but it does seem that you've got like 11, 12, 13-year-olds using vapes, and parents are quite understandably concerned about their pretty young children getting addicted to nicotine. So, yeah, I mean, the people come up with various different excuses for this, including the use of lithium batteries. I've heard the anti-smoking groups saying that the equivalent of 6,000 electric cars worth of battery are being thrown away every year. Now, people who know about these things tell me it's not even that much. But I mean, 6,000 electric cars really isn't very many when we're going to be making, or we already are making, millions of these things every year and need to make hundreds of millions. Yeah. So, people look for excuses to clamp down on things that are basically fairly harmless. I mean, this has been the theme of the episode so far, isn't it? And this is what the government's all about these days. It's what every major political party is interested in, is banning things for really trivial reasons. Just this week alone, we've had a ban on wet wipes proposed, a ban on power showers proposed, a ban on some sort of restriction on people under 25 spending too much money on gambling. And then the Labour Party plows in, the Blairites plow in with, we want calories shown on beer pumps and taxes on food. It's just endless, isn't it? And it's all so petty. And, there's this sort of clash between what the public want politicians to do, maintaining law and order, providing the foundations for a good economy, fixing potholes, taking the rubbish out, getting a doctor you can see when you're ill, not pumping raw sewage into the river. So all these things that people would expect politicians to do. And then there's the things that politicians think is their job, which is, stopping us eating so much sugar, or, 15-minute cities and using the right pronouns and being smoke-free by 2030 and banning adverts for this and that. They're in their own weird little bubble where they're kind of micromanaging people's lives to an extraordinary degree and unable to do the basics.
No, definitely. And I think that's very well put insofar as the more it seems like the British state can't do anything at all. The things that it's supposed to be doing, like, whether it's issuing your passport or, again, just making sure we've got decent energy security, whatever. It can't do any of that, but it can push you around constantly and micromanage your life to an absolutely absurd degree. And it is one of those things where you think at some point, surely, people are going to recognise it's not only deeply illiberal, it's also just a complete distraction, surely, from the big issues that we're facing, Mark.
Yeah, I guess that's right. But to strike a pessimistic note, from the narrow view of a politician's incentives and career advancement, it's quite easy to chalk up a win in this area, right? I mean, I agree with what Chris implied, that sort of, making sure people aren't stabbed on the streets, can, get medical treatment, and that we have energy security. These are indeed the important things, but they're not very easy things to do. Whereas bringing in some advertising ban such that, some new product can't be advertised on public transport, or every newsagent needs to have a poster underlining the health benefits of product A, B or C. Well, these are extremely easy for politicians to do. So it seems to be some sort of psychological displacement activity. If the big problems facing society and the economy and the desires of the electorate are A, B, C, D and E, but they're all in the too difficult to solve box, well, you might as well, I suppose, as a politician, turn your attention to F, G, H and I and at least give the impression that you're doing something and have piloted some sort of new law or regulation through. And that, I think, is probably going back to your earlier question, Tom, why we've lost so much ground in this area. It is so easy for campaigners and activist politicians to act, to no apparent good, but that isn't necessarily really, at least subconsciously, I don't think the good that comes out of it is important. It is something must be done. And this area, the areas that particularly Chris writes about for the IEA, are such easy targets. So I don't know. I would like to think that it comes to a head and there's some big philosophical clash and we get off this treadmill of ever more micromanagement. But micromanagement is pretty easy to do. It keeps politicians busy and they can all applaud each other and give each other public health awards for it. So until the incentives change, the behaviour of politicians probably isn't going to change.
That's probably true on the nanny state stuff because people are broadly speaking in favour of bans. I don't think it's so true with all the climate change stuff, and banning power showers and wet wipes and things that people really like and are used by the vast majority of the public. I think that's where it's all going to break down, when they really try and enforce, for example, a ban on gas boilers or a ban on petrol cars before people are ready for it. That's when there's going to have to be a U-turn, as there already has been recently in Germany, I think.
Well, that's the perfect segue, actually, to talk about our last topic here, which is the ULEZ, the ultra-low emission zone, which is being extended to all of Greater London. But also, I guess, just as a way in to talk about a lot of what you were touching on there, Chris, which is the kind of environmentalist war on people's lifestyles, particularly the car, the motorist seems to be a figure of particular scorn. So in London, we've had this ultra-low emission zone, which effectively means, I believe, that if you've got a petrol car built pre-2006 or a diesel car built pre-2015, you have to pay this daily £12.50 fine for driving within this zone. It used to just be the kind of City of London. It's since been expanded in 2021 to the North and South Circular. They now want to go the whole of Greater London, which obviously covers various suburban places which have barely any kind of air pollution problems to deal with. It's been a big kind of battleground for London Mayor Sadiq Khan. He seems very defensive on this particular issue because he's getting pushed back from all kinds of different places. As a consequence of this, we saw last week, but we've seen it in the recent months, he's taken to just denouncing anyone who disagrees with this expansion as far right and as Nazi aligned and so on. But this problem doesn't seem to be going away. You've got some of the suburban London boroughs which are refusing to implement this, as effectively trying to challenge it in whatever way they can. So it's not really going anywhere, Mark. But what do you make of this kind of war on the car in general? What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, it's pretty grim. And I think underlying this, I think that if you were to have any sympathy at all with environmental legislation and regulation of this type, you probably do need to start from some sort of cost-benefit analysis, right? If you think CO2 going into the atmosphere is bad for bad for climate change, and that is the consensus, but or air pollution. Well, how do you, in economic terms, internalise the externality, right? I don't think we can start from the position of just saying anybody should be able to drive a car as far as they want, as fast as they want, polluting the air as much as they want without that being priced in. But I think this goes back to, isn't it already priced in? I mean, petrol is heavily taxed, and it seems to me that's what should be doing the heavy lifting. We should work out what the damage is for, running off a litre of petrol in your car. A tax should be applied to that to reflect the damage it's causing. And you then, if you like, end up setting the correct market price, which if you don't internalise the externality, you haven't got the correct market price. Now, I haven't done the number crunching on this, but I think we're probably beyond that on what petrol tax is levied at. So to have a particular charge in a particular area strikes me as foolish. And to Chris's point, maybe I can strike a more optimistic note. And you've mentioned this as well, Tom. This does seem to have backlash, right? So it's not often with these things. I sort of shrug my shoulders, roll my eyes, and assume that the interventionists are going to prevail for sure. And people at the IEA and at Spiked might issue howls of derision. We sort of know we're going to lose. Not so much on this one. This seems to me very open on whether Sadiq Khan will prevail or not. And the unpopularity around it is pretty enormous. So you could well imagine, even if he does prevail, that it could end up being the undoing of his mayoralty, and perhaps he'll be replaced by somebody as London mayor who pledges to repeal it. But I do think the obligation on our side, the people who instinctively say, don't interfere with people's lives, we've got to get back to trying to internalise the externality. The problem, of course, is that usually then starts running away with you. Sort of the initial justification for cigarette taxes was, well, for each packet of cigarettes, you're costing the National Health Service X, so we should tax it at X. There's always a danger once you've brought in that tax at X, it's 2X, 3X or 5X before you know it. But at least on a theoretical basis, I think we should work out what damage we think is caused by petrol, reflect that in the petrol tax, and pretty much do nothing else.
Chris, do you share Mark's optimism that this policy is going to collide with just ordinary people in their lives at this point?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it depends a little bit on how many motorists there are in these areas. I guess there's more motorists in outer London than in inner London, but still possibly a minority. I don't know. I guess it varies by area. But yeah, I mean, there has clearly been a backlash on this. People are basically self-interested. The people who've got cars will be annoyed, and the people who don't have cars will be either indifferent or happy about it. I do find it kind of funny the way that Sadiq Khan just keeps referring to opponents of this policy as Nazis. Like quite explicitly, these people are Nazis. And it's partly because, to be fair, these issues now, post-COVID, every issue like this does get taken up by anti-vaxxers and loonies and Piers Corbyn. So the 15-minute city idea, which I think basically is quite a bad idea, was portrayed as being this is a climate lockdown by the people who are looking for something else to be mad about after lockdowns and vaccine program. And similarly, this ULEZ thing is portrayed as being some sort of World Economic Forum policy. And I think it's inevitable now that pretty much any controversial policy will be seized on by these people. And we just need to accept that, yes, some of them are going to be anti-vaxxers, some of them maybe even on the far right. But just because Piers Corbyn thinks something is wrong doesn't necessarily mean it isn't wrong.
No, completely. And they remain a minority of the people who are obviously actively campaigning in this. It's been striking how in London in particular, opposition to things like the ULEZ is pretty cross-class. Everyone thinks it's ridiculous that you talk to, apart from policymakers and people who work for the Labour Party or whatever. But again, I think, as you say, just because there's going to be a handful of nutters who latch onto these things for opportunistic reasons, for whatever reason, that conspiratorial part of politics likes to fashion itself, I think quite misleadingly, as a kind of almost populist thing, even though they tend to think most ordinary people are sheeple and so on. That's not really a neat fit. But nevertheless, they're trying to kind of speak in that language. They do, as you say, glom on to these issues. But to tar all of the opponents of these policies, as I say, far right, it's an absurd tactic as much as anything else, isn't it, Mark?
I wish you were right. I'm not so sure, actually. I think it's a problem for our side. You can't pick your fellow travellers on a particular issue, but I'm a little worried that, I became increasingly sceptical about lockdowns to a broadly libertarian view. I'm not an anti-vaxxer or anything, and I do often worry that if a relatively small number of lunatics are on our side of the ledger, that does toxify our arguments. So I agree, it's risible that Sadiq Khan is, saying anybody who opposes this is a Nazi or a fascist or on the alt-right. But if some people who are opposing it believe that, I don't know, I'm conjuring up the words here, I'm not quoting Piers Corbyn or anybody, but if the argument is put forward in the public domain by even a small number of people, that ULEZ is really a World Economic Forum Illuminati project to control all citizens on planet Earth and introduce a new economic world order. And, it starts to become down the sort of rabbit hole of sort of UFO conspiracy theories. Then, unfortunately, for more balanced, rational opponents of an interventionist policy, we do get tarred with that brush. I don't have a solution to that, but I do think a loud, rather eccentric, no doubt well-meaning, but often very crazy, over libertarianism of, the vaccines doesn't work, don't take it, and, everybody's motives are incredibly dark and aligned as if there's some enormous, great, grand political conspiracy, rather than my view that most politicians are incompetent rather than able to actually organise a conspiracy. We've got a problem. Whether Sadiq Khan's rather OTT response and tiring us all with this brush works, I don't know, but it does at least give him an opportunity to do so. And you can't pick your fellow travellers, but unfortunately they can undermine your arguments.
Yeah, and it also makes people less likely to, rally to your cause. Do you know what I mean? People who are persuadable or basically on your side might be less likely to speak out. And that's the annoying thing about these people, is often there is a kind of element of truth to what they're saying. The World Economic Forum should be criticised. It is a horrible organisation. It just isn't anywhere near as powerful as these people make out. Vaccine passports were a terrible idea, and there was no justification for them. But if you start, speaking out against them, you seem to be allying yourselves with fruitcake. So yeah, it's very irritating that these people do latch on to things that actually do justify criticism. But as Mark says, it does tar us all with the same brush.
I think it's all the more reason for the people who are opposing these things from a rational perspective not to be scared away from these things. I think because people don't like to be seen as bracketed off with some of these people, even completely unfairly, that it makes them kind of retreat in a slightly cowardly fashion, which I think people should be against. And also not, whilst, no one should be indulging these wild conspiracy theories, you can oppose these things strongly without opposing them in a crazy way and suggesting it's all Klaus Schwab's doing or whatever. And a bit more of that and a bit more bravery, the nutters would be surely more diluted as we go along, which would be a positive thing.
Yeah, that's definitely true, Tom. I mean, if the arena of public debate about policy in London is between Sadiq Khan and Piers Corbyn, we've got a big problem, whoever prevails, right?
The independent mayoral candidate we've all been waiting for, as it turns out. I know you both have to get on, so we should get to our postbag section, where listeners can send in their questions.
Postbag. It's bulging, eh?
And we've got one here from Twitter saying, what other things that people really enjoy do you think will be banned over the next decade? Let's start with you, Mark.
Well, I think alcohol's probably going to become more and more restrictive. I think probably Chris might disagree with me on this, but the high-profile issues at the moment around gambling. So I wouldn't go so far because, having said, I don't want to join the conspiracy theorists of saying, you won't be able to eat a Mars bar in 10 years' time. I don't think it will be as bad as that. I'm expecting it will just be a continual chipping away. These things will become more expensive, more restricted, less widely advertised, harder to source, more and more rules about where they can be displayed in a supermarket or a store. And I would think almost anything that could be considered to be bad for you, or as we were saying earlier in the show, Tom, potentially bad for the environment because it causes litter or it's wrapped in plastic or it involves a disposable canister. All of that is just going to be chipped away at. And but again, as I was thinking back to my teenage years, it was not particularly difficult for me as a teenager to smoke or drink. And I think that was actually, by and large, a better country to live in. So I think a general chipping away across the board. I wonder whether the alcohol industry is going to start to be treated like the tobacco industry, and it's going to be an awful lot harder. And I can imagine, I'm looking forward 5 or 10 years and speculating that much bigger penalties for landlords if a customer gets drunk or, has had more than 5 pints of beer or something. We're wildly speculating here, but I could see things going in that direction such that temperance becomes mandatory.
What about you, Chris? What do you think's for the chop in the next 10 years or so?
Well, gambling, as Mark says, there's a white paper coming out about that very soon, which will no doubt contain some prohibitions of some sort. There is talk this week about preventing people from spending a certain amount of money on gambling. Vaping, I think, we're looking into the medium term, 10, 15 years. Once smoking rates have gone down to a very low level, which I think they will do over that period, then the public health lobby will turn their guns on vaping, because by that time, presumably the majority of people who take up vaping will be non-smokers, and for some reason that's considered not acceptable. And also red meat. I was reading Henry Dimbleby's book recently, we reviewed it in fact, and he very much, I think, represents kind of mainstream political metropolitan opinion on this. He's absolutely against red meat. He thinks it will be displaced by artificial meat very quickly, which I'm not sure will happen. But red meat has so many different interest groups against it. You've not just got the environmentalists who are concerned about methane and greenhouse gases. You've also obviously got the vegetarians and the vegans. So, I would expect to see, not a ban, obviously, but maybe taxes and various limitations, health warnings even, on red meat.
And Chris, sticking with you for a second, we've got a question here from someone called Elon Mush, which I'm sure is their real name. Are there any harmful effects from vaping at all? And this is actually a question that Mark raised earlier that we didn't quite get to. But what is the evidence in terms of vaping's alleged harmful effects?
Well, it's still looking very good. The anti-vaping campaigners are having to resort to complaining about nicotine, really, and saying, nicotine alters the brain. Well, it's a mind-altering chemical, so that's true to some extent. Nicotine was never considered to be the big problem when pharmaceutical companies were producing all their pouches and gums and so on, and quite rightly so. It's obviously addictive to a lot of people, but in terms of its health impact, it's very similar to something like caffeine. They've been around now for 20 years. They've been a mainstream product for more than a decade, and we're not seeing any kind of acute or medium-term effects. There isn't much reason to think there would be some problem suddenly emerges in the long term. We know what's in them, basically, and there's so fewer chemicals in them, and they're not combusted. So it's the combustion that causes the problem, really, with smoking, along with the carbon monoxide, and you don't get either of those things with e-cigarettes. So both in theory and so far in terms of empirical evidence of studying people like me who've been vaping for over a decade, it's looking great. But, the usual thing that people in public health in this country at least say is that the risks are very unlikely to exceed 5% of those are smoking. And I think in practice now you could probably update that to say 1%.
I just wonder, Chris, though, can you break down different products in different ways? Is it... it's not quite that we can just sort of split smoking and vaping into binary categories, right? Even within smoking, there are different risks associated with cigarettes, pipe tobacco, and cigars. But within next generation products, I haven't been ticked off by you, but you've given me the occasional nudge that sort of heat not burn tobacco might not be quite as safe as a standard e-cigarette vape. And with the plethora of different products coming on the market, oral tobacco, there's a whole load of medical things, nicotine, chewing gum, God knows what else. Do you think they'll start to break down not just there's traditional ways of consuming tobacco which are dying out, and there are new ways, but within the new ways, we're going to characterize things as being, very low risk, quite low risk, medium risk, slightly high risk, and treat those very differently.
Yeah, and that's what's already being done by people like David Nutt, who I mentioned earlier on. There is a continuum of risk, and broadly speaking, you've got obviously cigarettes at the high end of that. Then your IQOS, the heat not burn stuff, is much lower down, but below that would be e-cigarettes, and below that would be nicotine pouches. Nicotine pouches are literally just cellulose and nicotine, right? There's so little chance of them being harmful in any meaningful way. And yet Belgium have just banned them. The Netherlands are trying to ban them at the moment. So it just shows you, really, that this isn't really about health at all. The arguments they've had to use in those countries to ban nicotine pouches have been absurd. I mean, you could apply them to almost anything. So yeah, there's a wave of Puritanism. It doesn't have a great deal to do with the risks. We've been talking now for 40 minutes about things that are all virtually harmless when it comes down to it, but they're under attack.
And speaking of wanting to ban things that are virtually harmless, just as a final question for you, Mark, it's not from the postbag, but I've taken to asking it of our guests. Given this is a libertarian podcast and you had a libertarian free market think tank, if you were to have one ban, what would it be? And I want the kind of most petty personal choice imaginable. Don't say you want to ban poverty or anything too worthy. I think Chris's was wheelie suitcases, which gives you a bit of a sense of how petty I want these to be.
Wheelie suitcases. Oh, that's... but there are probably certain things I'd like to ban, which would be a cheat, because I would like to ban the present scanners at airports, which are, in my view, way too risk adverse. I think actually from June next year you will be able to take liquids and laptops in your bags. But you're looking for something that I sort of rather disapprove of. That if I was a Puritan rather than a libertarian, what would I scrap? British football punditry, I think, should pretty much end. It is utterly dreadful and appalling. Nothing intelligent is ever said. It lowers people's appreciation of a magnificent game. And until we can raise our standards to the levels that you get if you are a follower of American sports, where the punditry is fantastic, perhaps it would be pretty good to ban Gary Lineker and Gary Neville from our screens until they can lift their analysis and punditry up to the standards that you get if you're watching the NFL or Major League Baseball. There you go. There's my petty ban for you.
VAR I'd stick in there as well.
Perfect place to end it. Mark, Chris, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Tom.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.